right. Shut that door, please, sir. Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thank you all for joining us today. This morning, we're here to take the first step in addressing the shortfalls of city government and our counterparts at quasi-agencies like HABC before and during the horrific mass shooting in Brooklyn homes on July 2nd, 2023. This morning, we officially released a combined after-action report that examines what each agency who are represented here today either did or, most importantly, did not do. That very night, when I arrived on scene, I began having a conversation with our Chief Administrative Officer, Faith Leach, and Commissioner Worley that we needed a detailed, unabashed accounting of what led to this mass shooting and how we responded to it. As the events of that night and the following days unfolded, it became clear that the accounting should be inclusive of every city agency who played a role. I wanted to make sure the assessment we would ultimately produce was comprehensive and uncompromising, utilizing best practices that have been developed after other mass shooting events like Vegas or the Pulse nightclub shooting in Florida. And that is what I feel we have with this document. This mass shooting is one of the most painful chapters in our city's history, which has had more than its fair share of painful chapters. We lost 2 young lives, Aaliyah Gonzalez, whose mom I've spoken to several times and who came to share her story of pain and hope for our city last night at our community engagement meeting, Khalees, who should be going about their lives and pursuing their dreams. Instead, their families join the dozens and dozens of others who are dealing with the trauma of this event and the devastating impact that it will have on them and our city forever. These reports and this press conference are rightfully focused on city government's actions, but we have never stopped pursuing the justice that Brooklyn homes and Baltimore as a whole deserves. There were individuals who made the cowardly, reckless decision to pull the trigger that night with any regard for human lives around them, and we will not rest until we hold all of them accountable. This investigation has not and never will slow down until it is fully complete. The only way that we can begin to heal the trauma is to begin by focusing on accountability. Accountability for those who committed the crime. Accountability for the police or anyone who showed indifference. Accountability for city government that made missteps. And then taking action to ensure that this never happens again in our city. That is why I tasked the city administrator with bringing together BPD, HABC, MONSE, OEM, and the fire department to craft these individual independent after-action reports. I was also clear that while I wanted a detailed accounting of mistakes made and actions taken or not taken, I also wanted each report to identify clear recommendations on actions that city government should be taking. I want to be explicit with all Baltimoreans. We are setting a path forward with the goal of ensuring every mistake outlined in these reports is never repeated. The document also begins with a memo drafted by the city administrator, which arose from her efforts leading this process and includes other recommendations, which are in addition to the ones that each agency report focus on interagency collaboration and coordination. I will pursue these recommendations immediately and ensure they are implemented as swiftly as possible. There are more than a dozen of these recommendations included in the compiled document, but there are a few that I want to lift up. 1, we will be convening the Brooklyn community specifically to provide space for a dialogue about these reports, their findings, and their recommendations. 2, we will be continuing our efforts to wrap our arms around that community by continuing and, in some cases, expanding the services that our teams have been diligently providing since July the 2nd. 3, we are expanding the way that agencies communicate with each other and with the community about events around the city, both permitted and unpermitted. 4, we are taking another look at what state legislation we can pursue that may have an impact on this event, like changes to home monitoring systems that we know has consistently been an issue in Baltimore City. I mentioned this briefly at the beginning, but it's important to note that through this process, the agencies ran their own after-action report efforts and independently drafted them. You'll notice as you review the document that each of the reports have retained their independent identity, and that was done intentionally because this is about each agency looking internally at themselves. Because of the scope and the length of this report, we're not going to be able to get to every detail included in them, so I've asked each agency here to discuss the process that their team went through and note a couple key highlights, and we will jump into questions after that. We'll begin with Commissioner Worley.
Yes, sir. Good morning. Thank you, Mayor Scott and other members of the Cabinet who have joined us here today. In the early morning hours of July 2nd, Mayor Scott, Chief Administrative Officer Leach, and I were on the scene of Brooklyn, and we vowed to find out what happened, how it occurred, and why, and to fix it. Within 24 hours of the incident, I directed our Compliance Bureau, led by Deputy Commissioner Eric Melanson, to launch a comprehensive after-action report into everything that occurred before, during, and after the incident. We know we made mistakes. It was important that our after-action report not only mentioned those mistakes, highlighted those mistakes and the shortcomings, but also provides recommendations to improve and learn from. We will continue to fix what went wrong and ensure better responses and strengthen our relationships within the community to ensure something like this never happens again. In the midst of completing our report, we also uncovered actions of some personnel after the incident that were heroic and will be addressed and identified, and those officers will receive recognition. I want to be very clear, this report is the very first process. It was done and put out. There are now internal investigations that are taking place as a result of this. We're still going to continue to gather information. We'll investigate any additional information that comes to light with the goal of making the department better. At the same time, our detectives continue to work around the clock on the criminal investigations. Any reports of this investigation winding down are simply untrue and, more importantly, irresponsible. We will continue to work with our local, state, and federal partners during this investigation. Today, I want to announce that the reward for information related to this incident has been escalated to $88,000. My hope is that this comprehensive review provides transparency and helps the department continue to build trust with the residents and with the public overall. I will end that BPD will and can do better. Thank you for this time. Now I'll turn it over to the Housing Authority Chief.
Good morning. I want to thank the mayor. I want to thank Mayor Scott and his team for taking the important steps to look at the incident that happened at Brooklyn Homes on July 2nd. First and foremost, we must not forget the individuals and families who have been deeply impacted by this incident. Our hearts and prayers continue to be with every victim, family members, and resident. It has been a challenging time for Baltimore City. As we continue to help the community heal, it is important that we reflect on our response and actions immediately following the incident. We conducted an internal review and identified key findings and recommendations for the agency. Our review has been incorporated into the city's larger report, and it is also available on our website. As we continue to look at the recommendations that we provided through our team, the team was started doing their analysis the time we hit the ground. We realized there were several key items that we needed to address. Number one, security. As you all know, the Housing Authority no longer employ a police department. However, we have since engaged armed security through contract services, and as of 8/1, those services are being provided at Brooklyn Homes. We also look at our 800 number. We have a 24-hour emergency number, but we realize that the importance of making sure residents are aware of what that number should be used for and when it should be used was lacking, and that our agency will now implement and take every measure necessary to share that information with our residents. We also looked at our emergency preparedness plan. We do have an emergency preparedness plan that was first put together with the agency and with outside consultant. We realized that there was a gap. So we are in negotiations to bring that team back into the Housing Authority to conduct tabletop exercises with our team, but also to update our plan. We're also working closely with the city, as the mayor mentioned, to ensure that our activities on our property, whether it's an outside sponsored event or an internal sponsored event, that it is permitted properly and that they are following every necessary steps to ensure our residents' safety. As we continue to look at ourselves and we continue to look at this incident, we cannot begin to take the time to say to everyone, we as HABC understand the frustration that everyone feels. And we're clear about how we will move forward in working with our families. We want to make sure that when our community joins together, we can realize opportunities that promote safe neighborhoods, which is what we continue to promote at HABC. Thank you.
Good morning, all. My name's Stephanie Mavronis, Interim Executive Director of the Mayor's Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement. MONSE has been the lead agency responsible for the implementation of the Mayor's Coordinated Neighborhood Stabilization Response, or CNSR, in the immediate aftermath of the Brooklyn Homes mass shooting on July 2nd. My agency's After Action report centers on that activation in Brooklyn Homes, as well as the role of violence intervention work, both at Brooklyn Day prior to the mass shooting and in the weeks after the incident. First, I want to take this moment to publicly thank all of the more than 60 community-based partners, service providers, and city and state agencies who immediately mobilized to provide resources and support to the Brooklyn community, including our Safe Streets staff, who continued showing up for this community while dealing with their own trauma from the incident, to render support for their neighbors and work to shift cultural norms associated with the acceptability of gun violence. In the initial weeks post-incident, our team touched over 370 individuals based on sign-ins, and we estimate that that number is actually much larger when we think about some of the general outreach that our team was engaged in during that CNSR activation. This was and needed to be a massive undertaking to address the immense amount of trauma in the community and qualifies as MONSE's largest CNSR to date. In our After Action report, the public can expect to find an outline of what went well, as well as opportunities for improvement, findings and recommendations that were the result of our team conducting an intense feedback process after the first week and a half of our stabilization efforts. Although the 45 days of immediate stabilization have passed, MONSE will continue to work with local organizations in Brooklyn, faith leaders, and other providers to remain engaged and support community-led event planning for Brooklyn Homes residents. Much of this work, as we outline in our report, has already begun. There's no end date to our community support, and we thank the Brooklyn community for their honesty, candor, and trust in the past 2 months. I want to end by recognizing that while this incident has greatly traumatized many direct and indirect victims within the Brooklyn community, as well as the entire city of Baltimore, we will not stop working to facilitate healing, address residual trauma, and move forward as a village to improve the safety of Baltimoreans regardless of zip code. I'm proud of the speed and diligence of my team, who activated in a matter of hours and immediately brought resources into this community to help stabilize. I'm proud of the unprecedented magnitude of partnership and collaboration with our fellow agencies, including the police department, OEM, the fire department, and housing authority, to support this community. And I remain proud of this administration's steadfast commitment to tackling violence by focusing on integrated solutions, including mediation, violence intervention, victim services, alongside traditional law enforcement. It's important to remind Baltimore that prior to this administration, there was no central place where victims of gunshot or secondary victims of violence could go to receive victim services. That's changed, and we saw agencies responsible for victim services, from MONSE, BPD to State's Attorney's Office, on-site working together to effectively serve Brooklyn Homes residents. It was only in the last year, in 2022, that we first piloted Coordinated Neighborhood Stabilization Response, and MONSE was prepared to quickly mobilize despite the unprecedented scale of this incident. This is work that MONSE, under the mayor's leadership, has built from the foundation up within city government, and we'll continue pushing ourselves to improve on every single aspect within our portfolio to drive these efforts forward for Baltimore. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is James Wallace. I'm the acting chief of the fire department. As acting chief of the department, I'm speaking on behalf of the department as well as the Office of Emergency Management. Our reports, which you have in writing, also reflect our actions as well as shortcomings, and they also present recommendations and pathways forward for improvement. They are formatted in a series of timelines. They're reflective of actions taken by our 911 call takers, our dispatchers, our field providers, incident commanders, and importantly, our mutual aid partners. Our reports encompass timelines beginning with initial 911 data, and they conclude with the sustained recovery efforts in the Brooklyn community over subsequent days and weeks. Data collected is based on two factors: CAD data and employee interviews. Upon receiving initial notifications and dispatch of this incident, our EMS and fire suppression resources were on scene within minutes. This was an extraordinarily difficult and complicated incident scene, as it not only encompassed the Brooklyn Homes area, it also expanded over to Harbor Hospital. Although patients were scattered initially throughout a 6-square-block area, we were quickly able to identify each and every patient that warranted care, assessed, and immediately transported them to more definitive care. I want to thank our fire and EMS personnel for their quick action under extraordinary conditions, and I also want to express my thanks to our mutual aid partners, our state partners, our private partners, and especially our hospitals. We'll continue to review our after-action report. We will continue to take a deeper dive into the data we have, and we will improve things moving forward. I'm extraordinarily proud not only of the initial response, but of the Office of Emergency Management for their actions moving forward in support of Monsi and Mayor Scott's administration in subsequent days. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. And now we will begin taking questions.
We're going to begin by prioritizing a question and a follow-up from each outlet to make sure that everyone can get their question in, and then we'll do additional questions after that. I'm going to start with the Baltimore Sun.
One of the things in the equity assessment part of BP's report mentioned that residents felt like if this had taken place in a white neighborhood, that the response would have been swifter and more strategic in dispersing a crowd. This question's for the acting commissioner and for the mayor. Do you think there's truth to that, and how do you fix that?
Well, I think that we know when you think about Brooklyn, you think about Southern District, when you think about police districts in Baltimore, we know that there's been inequity. In fact, that's the reason why I've been leading the efforts to redistrict Baltimore police districts for more than a decade, because we know neighborhoods where police listen. The truth is that redistricting went into a week after this happened. Brooklyn was served by one patrol officer for all those many years, right? Handling 17% of the calls for the entire Southern District. That is inequity at its finest, and that's why we were already leading on that work of changing that, and now it has three post officers that are responsible for that neighborhood, that allows for it to be policed in a more equitable way. This isn't something that I waited for this unfortunate mass shooting to happen to address. It's something that I've literally been addressing since December the 8th, 2011, when I was first sworn in, because we know that policing in Baltimore had been done inequitably for decades because we hadn't redistricted our districts and allocate our resources in a different way since 1959, right? We are talking about systemic things, and we know that Brooklyn is a mixed neighborhood. I know the commissioner knows that more than most because he lived there, but we know that neighborhood had been served inequitably for many, many years, which is why we were leading on those changes even before this event.
Yeah, and the only way you can fix a problem is if you identify the problem and know the problem and come up with solutions. This was just the first. This was a very small, quick study. We need to do a more in-depth study of not just the Southern District, but the entire city to see if these inequities are occurring elsewhere, and we need to fix them. The good thing, like Mayor Scott said, is with the redistricting, we've balanced out the workload so that this doesn't happen. Like the mayor said, the Brooklyn Homes car was one car, handled over 8,500 calls for service in 1 year, which was 17%. The average that any call should have handled in the Southern was 7. So they were handling more than double the calls, which means they were running from call to call. And that's still not an excuse, but we identified the problem. We want to fix the problem. The only way to do that is by having our equity officer look over the entire city and continue to work to improve everything.
Go next to the banner.
My question's for Acting Commissioner. Are there any plans for disciplinary action to be taken against personnel who made oversights or exhibited indifference in the lead up to the shooting? Is that something that you will publicly relay when it happens?
It has already occurred. What happens with the Compliance Bureau does the investigation. They do not charge, they do not do any type of investigation with the officers or the sergeants or the lieutenants. They turn all their findings over to the Public Integrity Bureau. The Public Integrity Bureau has already served some members with charging papers for different charges during the incident. And they will investigate those, and we will release what happens, if anything. We're not going to release names. We release some of the discipline, but it is a process that just started. But I can tell you yesterday, several of them were served with charging papers.
So some of those disciplinary actions have been determined at this point?
No, the disciplinary action, all we know is what we have preliminarily. And those are just broad investigations. Now it's Public Integrity Bureau's job to do a deep dive into everything that the Compliance Bureau gave them to interview the officers, because if we interview officers, detectives, sergeants, anyone in the Compliance Bureau, we compromise the public integrity, the internal investigation. So they just had different documents to look at. So now it goes to a more in-depth dive to see what exactly wasn't done, and to hold those accountable who didn't do their job.
Go next to WMAR-TV.
Thank you. And we also just, not disciplinary, and there's no, we did not, we don't want one person to be a scapegoat for this incident. This was a issue where we could have done better on multiple fronts. Yesterday, we did put a new major in the Southern District. He was promoted from Captain Jason Bennett, was promoted to captain, was moved to the Southern District, and the major in the Southern District was reassigned.
Thank you very much. I wanted to follow up on the banner's question, because the report says the recommendation to implement changes within the command staff and refer offending personnel to the Police Integrity Bureau. How many people are we talking about, and what are the nature of those complaints?
I can't get into that. I can tell you there are multiple people that were served with papers yesterday, and there's probably more to come, because the Public Integrity Bureau has had the report only for about a week to look at some things. So they're going to do a deep dive into everything, and if we're going to continue to do this. So if we get more information a month from now, 6 months from now, that other people knew about this and never escalated up the chain of command, or held information, we can continue to investigate this and hold those accountable who made mistakes during this incident.
WJZ.
I'm just wondering, either the commissioner or the mayor, at the heart of this, why do you think some warnings were ignored? Why do you think there was some inaction and lack of communication? What's at the bottom of this?
The truth is that I don't really care. What it's about now is about holding people accountable who should have done things or didn't share that information, right? What really matters is that we have 2 young people dead and 28 other people shot, and we have to have accountability at every level for them and their families in that community.
WMAR.
Yeah, on the day of the incident, the report shows that, which you mentioned before, Commissioner, there were several dozen discretionary officers available. Is there a reason? Do we know why they were never called on?
Honestly, that is the thing that has me scratching my head, because we have dealt with incidents, not as large as this, but we deal with incidents every single day since COVID, of pop-up parties and things that we don't know about that we have handled that have never escalated to anything like this. And we've dealt with multiple ones since then. We know how to handle this. We give a cease and desist order to the person who is organizing the party, and we break the party up. Why we didn't do that here, that's why the investigation is ongoing. And it's frustrating for me, because if we didn't have the people available, I understand, but we had over 100 officers available throughout the city that we could have moved there in a short period of time.
I have a follow-up question. So can you kind of explain the process of how that works? Would they have alerted the other officers first, or would they have had to go on scene first to kind of assess what happened, and then they alert?
Well, we were on the scene throughout the day, so the officers and the supervisors who were in Brooklyn that day knew Brooklyn Day was happening. at some point during the day. They knew the incident, they knew what this event was, they knew that it was a large event. The supervisors at the time never escalated that up. It's a really simple process. We have a duty officer. We had a lieutenant who's a gold badge who was overseeing the Southern District. His only job was to oversee the Southern District and make sure any big events happen. He could escalate it up to the captain who was overseeing the Southern District as well as 2 other districts. And there was a duty officer who oversaw the whole city. The duty officer didn't get information about this until 20 minutes before the incident happened, and even then, additional resources were not asked for. We could have asked for resources. We could have done so many things differently that could have helped with a different outcome, but we didn't. And those who didn't do that will be held accountable.
Fox 45.
This is a question for the interim director, Monty. Stephanie. According to this, 3 of the 5 mediations completed by Safe Streets workers, we know that they took place before the shooting happened. 3 of 5 took place before we're told the Safe Streets workers arrived at the Brooklyn Day event. Where did those mediations take place, and is there any indication that the people involved in those mediations were either victims or suspects in the shooting?
I would dispute what you said about the mediations taking place before the workers arrived on scene. I know that the earliest staff arrived on scene around 4 o'clock and were there at the event. There were some staff who were diverted to other posts a little later that afternoon, but returned around 9 p.m. So we did have Safe Street staff on site as early as 4 p.m. I can't say whether these incidents involved victims or suspects in the incident, but what I can say is that from thorough conversations with our staff, these incidents were considered mediated, and so there was not an indication that this was a scene that was about to boil over, and that any incidents that took place there, whether verbal fights or other incidents, were considered resolved.
And then just a quick follow-up. I know that there was some discussion of staffing issues at the Brooklyn site in here in terms of vacancies. I know that there's a site supervisor position posted for the Brooklyn location according to Catholic Charities. That position was posted on July 28th. Was the person in place at the time of this incident, and did that person leave as a result of what happened?
I don't believe that's the case, but I would have to check to verify. I know that we've been looking to fill staffing vacancies across all 10 of our Safe Street sites, and so that's something I'm happy to look into further.
WYPR.
Hi, yes. One of the CAO's recommendations was that going forward, they would conduct multi-agency tabletop exercises with department leaders, city staff, executive staff, elected officials, etc., to fortify the city's preparedness for a critical incident. That exercise would define roles and responsibilities during a critical incident. Does that mean that the agencies assembled here in front of us have not been doing any type of preparedness together, coordinating for an incident like a mass shooting? Can you talk about that some more?
No, that's not what this means. I think that when you see how the agencies came together very quickly and on site, that's something that works well under Chief Wallace's leadership in his former role. I'll let him talk about how we consistently work with other agencies in emergency fashion, whether it be the explosions that we've had over the past few years, whether it's weather-related incidents. We know that, but we want to continue to grow and improve that, and I'll let the city administrator and Chief Wallace talk about the efforts that are going to undertake to do that.
Hi, good morning again, and yes, thank you for your question. So several things that OEM does is we organize tabletop exercises under different auspices. We may do one under a nexus of a hurricane. We may do one under the nexus of a large fire, water main break, and things like that. We bring together multiple agencies when we do that. During COVID, we were even doing them, we did them via Teams. So in the absence of being able to put people at a table and actually do it, we were doing it during Teams. The other big initiative that's been going on now for well over a year has been bringing in external training sources into the city and opening up the training not only to all city agencies, but to our partners in the sports venue and some of our college venues. So our efforts to provide ongoing training are, have been consistent throughout my 3 years in OEM and remain consistent today.
Go to the APRA.
Yep, I'll let the city administrator walk you through that one.
Absolutely, thank you. So this recommendation just speaks about us co-producing the immediate actions with the community, right? So this isn't something that the administration will do alone. This is something that we will do in partnership with the community. And so they will determine what that community compact looks like, what's included in the community compact. There could be goals and or commitments that are outlined in that compact that the police put forward and or that the community puts forward. So this will be ongoing work that we will do in conjunction with the community. As Monty has talked about, we have been in Brooklyn nearly every day since this mass shooting incident has occurred. And we continue to work with the community. We'll be out there again this week. We have multiple follow-up meetings that are happening this week, and we'll continue to work with the community to develop what that compact looks like, but it will be something that we co-produce with the community and that we own with the community.
And how soon will that be fruition?
So I think the report says that we would start that process within 30 days.
WBAL Radio.
This is for the acting police commissioner. The report mentioned evidence gathering. Was evidence compromised at all in this investigation in terms of cleanup of the scene, maybe during and afterward? And is that hampering the investigation as far as finding who directly is responsible for shooting the victims involved here?
No, it was not. What happened, the way the investigation worked, our crime lab detectives were on the scene at the very beginning of the incident. They started collecting data. They went all throughout the morning. In the morning, they thought they had, and they collected every piece of data that they wanted, every piece of data that the homicide detectives wanted them to collect. Now, if you saw the scene, it looked like the infield of Preakness, after Preakness, if you remember Preakness, when all the trash and debris. So we figured there were things under the trash and debris that we hadn't recovered. So we had to move some of the debris. Once we started moving debris, we did find some more casing, some more evidence, and the crime lab techs were able to collect that. It hasn't hampered the investigation. The only thing that hampered the investigation is we have multiple shooters with over 100 casings that we have to track and put on a drawing that shows where these casings came from. But the investigation hasn't been hampered. I'm not frustrated with the investigation. Our detectives are working around the clock. We still have conference calls to talk about where the investigation is at, and we will be making some arrests. So it is something that I wish we could go faster, but you can't force an investigation to go any quicker than the evidence and the manpower, and we start tracking down each one of these shooters.
And I just would add to that I know there's been a lot of talk about when BPD and others allowed folks to enter into the scene, but we have to remember we were not going to do what we did in Harlem Park, where we locked down the whole neighborhood. People lived there, and we had to allow those people to get back into their homes. They were already going through enough trauma, and we did this in accordance with best practices and learning from those incidents like we saw in Harlem Park.
Go to the Baltimore Beat.
Mayor Scott, at the first city council hearing held about this incident, Kobe Little, the president of the NAACP, had some pretty harsh words for you because he has called for a wider search for BPD's next commissioner. Why was this not kind of a disqualifying incident for acting Commissioner Worley, or is there something that would make it a disqualifying event?
Well, this is not on the acting police commissioner. I think, and Reverend Little has had conversations with both me and the commissioner since then and since that hearing. And I think that what we have to understand, this was like a few days in for the commissioner, right? And he understands and knows what's happening there, but what this report outlines for you and outlines for everybody is what happened and what should have happened and who should have acted, and we'll be holding those folks accountable. What would be disqualifying for the commissioner is nothing is there. There are no internal affairs things from him in his past. There are no misconduct and allegations. There is no inability for him to lead this department. There's none of that. This incident, we have to remain focused first and foremost on those people who pulled the trigger, and then also those, as we outlined in this report, who should have been doing other things and did not for whatever reason.
We're going to go to additional questions next. If you can just identify yourself and your outlet. And did I miss someone here? We'll start with you.
All right.
Yeah, from Jen from the Baltimore
idea of having an outside investigation conducted to look at this beyond the police and beyond the city, but from outside, has been suggested by people in the community. And during the first city council hearing on this, council member Odette Ramos brought it up too. What do you think of that, either from the perspective of the history of the department in terms of the gun trace task force, or just simply from a best practices point of view? Should this not be considered? Why not consider that? Why is that not really a best practice for your city here?
Well, first, I think the first thing we have to do is look internally, right? We have to do that ourselves, right? And this is what happened in those other places that had mass shootings. And I want to also highlight that we turned this very thorough document over a lot quicker than those other places. We're always open to that discussion. I want to remind everyone that any and everything that BPD does right now is going to have an outside look, because we're under a federal consent decree from the Department of Justice, right? So we know that this report, all of these things that have come forward, they're going to see themselves. But we are always open as we get through this, especially after we get through the internal portions of this, where there may or may be discipline forthcoming, that we can go back and have a further look. But it was my responsibility as the mayor and CEO of this city to make sure that we looked at ourselves and talked about what accountabilities and changes that we could do ourselves before even asking anyone else to do it.
Just quickly, one for the acting commissioner. There's something in the report mentioning that last year's Brooklyn Day was shut down by the department, and kind of implying that there was some resentment or from the organizer, because we're not going to, okay, we're going to keep this quiet this year, and maybe some sense of that on the part of the officers.
Yeah, it wasn't.
Can you talk about that?
Sure, it wasn't shut down. What happened is we knew about it, and what we did is we monitored it. We had officers present. They still had the event. People still enjoyed themselves. For whatever reason, we didn't know about it this year. We should have, and we could have. We had chances all during the day to do the same thing, and we missed those chances, and we now have to hold ourselves accountable for it. One thing I told you at the hearing is, I'm going to be honest with you. This report tells you what we did and didn't do and what we could have done. I can't be any more honest than to tell you we made mistakes and that we'll fix them. And those who made those mistakes will be held accountable.
I have a question for the Housing Authority. I'm Darcy Costello from the Baltimore Sun. So the after action report for the Housing Authority talks about how there wasn't authorization in advance and the hotline didn't get calls during the event or leading up to it. But the fact is that there were hundreds of people gathering on a Housing Authority property, and the agency seems to not have been aware of that at all. Is that a gap that needs to be addressed? What are you guys doing about that?
Well, I think what I wanted to make clear, we are a public housing agency. So we don't have live-in janitors or staff living on site as they would in market rate properties where you have live-in janitors, live-in managers. We don't have that. Our staff went home on Friday at 3 o'clock. They were not due back to the site until Tuesday morning, 8 o'clock. Unless someone used the 800 number to notify the emergency services that this was going on, there was no way for us to know what is happening on the site. Should we have known? Of course, simply because our residents were on the site, they got the messages out to each other, and should we have known during the time that they were planning it? As the commissioner mentioned, last year when we found the flyers, we were the ones that went to the police department and made sure that they were aware of this party that was going to take place. We brought them the information, and we were aware and were keen to what was happening and stayed in contact with the police while they were there. So I think it's important for us to really understand we don't have live-in maintenance people. So unless we are notified through a flyer or through our residents, we would not know what's happening on the site. No one lives there.
And is the security contract kind of meant to also address that?
Yes, it is. The security contractors are working double shifts. They start 3 in the evening and they go until the next morning when staff get on site. So we have covered that with the paid security contractors.
Also, I've heard a few housing advocates express concern about some comments you made about possible punitive measures, evictions, worried that these might harshly impact people who are already traumatized following this. Can you talk a little bit more about whether that's still kind of one of the things that you guys are reaching for? Is that something that's on the table for you?
So first of all, I just want to be clear that I have never said anything about evicting residents. We are putting processes and policies in place to ensure that people are held accountable when they are not following the lease or the continued occupancy policy. Yes, we are putting those things in place because it's important for us to make sure that we have rules and regulations at these sites. That's the only way we can manage properties that house so many people. So I never said we were going to evict anyone. It was, I don't know where that reference came from. That is not our intent.
Yeah, I was just kind of following up, are the organizers of this party not subject to eviction? Are they not being considered for eviction?
So just to be clear, what we're doing, as I mentioned before, we have MOUs that we enter into with our families, okay? And so from an MOU standpoint, we meet with families, we talk about where they breached their lease, and we talk about what they need to do to ensure that the continued occupancy stays in place. So we're not evicting anyone. We are meeting with families to let them know that we, as the housing authority, understand that there were some breach in our lease and that we want to work with them moving forward. We're not evicting anyone. If any eviction happens right now in the housing authority, it's for non-payment of rent. That's what we're moving forward on.
Thank you, David Collins, WMAR-TV. I want to follow up on a Safe Streets question. Safe Streets had good intel that the event was happening and mediated, as has been pointed out already, trouble between groups. Will policy changes be made to get this type of information to authorities without jeopardizing or compromising Safe Streets' mission?
Thank you for that question. The after-action report and the recommendations from MONSE do outline proposed language for changes that we're looking to put in place with our nonprofit providers, as well as with our Safe Streets sites. We want to make sure there's very strong two-way communication between city government and Safe Streets. Unfortunately, as the acting commissioner has shared, the department did have awareness of this event, and we know that flyers were circulated in the community at least by late in the month. And so we want to make sure that we're able, moving forward, to have very strong intelligence between Safe Streets and the Mayor's Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement so that we have the proper situational awareness.
And Stephanie, just as a follow-up, how would that work?
I think we outline a few things. Our team already provides strong technical assistance to Safe Streets, and so we meet with sites on a weekly and sometimes daily basis. So we are in communication. As you can see in our outline recommendations, there are a few proposed policies that we're considering right now with our sites. So that would look like everything from awareness of an event that's going to have more than 50 people or more, sharing that information with us. If there's prior intelligence about the potential for conflict at an upcoming event between, let's say two groups that potentially have challenges with each other, that's the kind of thing we want escalated. And particularly in real time, if there are concerns about a large event, for example, where the capacity for our Safe Streets violence interrupters to mediate is not possible, or we're getting at the top of their capacity, we want them to immediately escalate that to us so that we can figure out the best way to move forward. So those are some of the things.
Just a quick follow-up on that, Stephanie. We heard you talk about that at the first news conference. I think this is only the second time we've had an opportunity to ask questions to all of you about this. We heard you talk about the plans for expanding the escalation criteria and updating the standard operating procedure manual. That was last month. We're still here talking about the idea of possibly implementing that. How much longer will the community wait for these changes to be made?
We're making changes immediately. The recommendations include a proposed policy, and so we're in the process right now of finalizing that. But we're absolutely having conversations with our Safe Street sites about what that needs to look like. I'll remind this audience that it wasn't until the Scott administration that we even had standard operating procedures documented to govern how the installation of Safe Streets should look across the city. And so that's something we're very committed to doing and will continue doing. As I mentioned, we have proposed language right now, and so we're looking to finalize that in the coming weeks. It's something that we want to make sure we can sit down, vet with the staff who are going to be on the front lines having to adhere to this policy. And so we released this publicly today, and we're looking forward to incorporating it into the manual.
Last question.
I have a question for HABC. Why do you think it was that residents didn't communicate with management about this event? Do you think that's any indication of a lack of trust or understanding between residents and management? And does HABC bear some responsibility in that?
I think it's a little bit of both, right? I think we do have some trust issues with residents and management at the site. We are looking into that, and we're working with our management team to ensure that they have proper communications with the residents. And also, I think when you look at the fact that the Tenant Association, we just swore them in May, and we were working with them to understand their role in the community. So there were some breakdowns. There were some breakdowns on our part. Again, we as HABC understand that we should have better communications with our families. We can only do what we can do when it comes to our management team on site. They are the eyes and ears for the agency. So we understand there was a breakdown and there was a break in that communications. What we are hoping as we continue to move forward with our security unit, which is outlined in our report, that we will have more intel. Because last year, when we were able to get our hands on the flyer, that was through our security operations unit. Unfortunately, he retired from the agency in May of this year. And we have been looking to fill those positions. We hope to have them filled by, one by the end of September and the other by the end of this year. So hopefully that will help with the communications. But we are clear that there was a breakdown.
Thank you, everybody.